On the edge of a crumbling plantation, where moss clung to broken walls like a burial shroud, stood a single door that history refused to forget, yet no one dared to touch. For 60 years, that room remained sealed, nailed shut, boarded over, and spoken about only in whispers. Locals said you could hear breathing behind its walls at night. Others swore the air around it turned cold, even in the dead heat of summer. This was no ordinary locked chamber. It was a vault of buried sins, a silent witness to cruelty, and a scar the plantation owners tried to erase from memory. Generations passed, families died, and the house decayed, but the door remained. Unopened, unforgiven, untouched. Then one day the seal was broken, the lock cracked, the darkness inside stirred, and what emerged was far worse than anyone could have imagined. This is the story of a room that held more than dust. It held the weight of a broken past that refused to stay buried. If stories like this send a chill down your spine, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the truth hidden beneath history. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Your voice is part of this story. The plantation rose from the red soil like a wound that never healed, its white columns shining in daylight while concealing centuries of brutality behind them. Built in the late 18th century by a wealthy landowner who profited from tobacco, cotton, and human bondage, the estate was designed not just as a home, but as a monument to power. From the main house to the distant slave quarters, every structure reflected a rigid hierarchy in which black lives were treated as property, tools, and numbers in a ledger rather than human beings. Travelers passing the property saw only elegance, manicured gardens, and sweeping fields, but beneath that surface lay a system sustained by fear, punishment, and relentless control. At dawn, enslaved men, women, and children were forced into the fields before the sun fully rose, their backs already aching from the previous day's labor. Overseers patrolled the rows with whips and rifles, ensuring that no one slowed, rested, or whispered to one another. Stories passed down through descendants spoke of cruel masters who measured productivity not by harvest, but by suffering, pushing people beyond physical limits while offering no mercy. In the evenings, lanterns flickered through the slave cabins where families tried to preserve fragments of culture, faith, and identity in a world determined to erase them. Even in darkness, the plantation remained a place of constant surveillance and dread. The main house stood in stark contrast, filled with luxury imported from Europe, fine china, and portraits celebrating the family's lineage. Dinner parties were held where guests laughed, drank wine, and discussed profits made from stolen labor while ignoring the muffled cries drifting from the fields. The owners carefully crafted their public image as benevolent landholders, yet punishment cells and iron restraints were hidden in outbuildings behind the mansion. Records later revealed that deaths were rarely investigated and instead logged as routine losses, as if human beings were no more valuable than broken tools. This contrast between grandeur and cruelty defined the plantation's true character. Over time, the estate gained a grim reputation among nearby communities who spoke of disappearances that were never explained. Runaways were hunted with dogs, dragged back in chains, and subjected to brutal retaliation meant to terrify others into obedience. Oral histories suggested that some were confined in isolated spaces as punishment, never seen again by their families. The land itself seemed to absorb this violence, with many saying certain corners of the property felt heavy, haunted, or cursed. Generations of enslaved people lived and died there without leaving anything behind except scars, memories, and whispered warnings. As decades passed, the plantation changed hands multiple times, yet its foundation of exploitation remained unshaken. New owners often tried to rewrite its history, burning old records or painting over decaying walls, but the suffering embedded in the estate could not be erased so easily. Weather slowly began to eat away at the buildings, peeling paint from columns and rotting wooden beams that once supported opulence. Still, the central house loomed like a silent witness, guarding secrets buried deep within its structure. Every crack in its façade hinted at the darkness that lay beneath. The lives of those enslaved there were marked by separation, as families were frequently torn apart and sold to other plantations. Mothers lost children, husbands lost wives, and entire communities were shattered for profit. Despite this, small acts of resistance persisted in songs, spiritual practices, and coded messages passed between workers. These fragments of humanity stood in stark opposition to the dehumanizing machinery of the estate. Yet the plantation owners viewed even these cultural expressions as threats, often punishing them harshly to maintain control. By the mid-20th century, the plantation had become a decaying relic of a brutal past, but its reputation lingered. Locals avoided the property, claiming that the spirits of those who suffered there still walked the grounds. Though slavery had long been abolished, the physical and psychological scars of the estate remained visible in broken structures, neglected graves, and unresolved stories. The land carried the weight of everything that had happened upon it, waiting for a moment when its deepest secrets would finally be exposed. The room did not begin as a mystery, yet it became one through fear, silence, and deliberate erasure. Deep within the western wing of the plantation house, it sat at the end of a narrow corridor, where sunlight rarely reached. Built originally as a storage chamber for documents and valuables, its thick brick walls and iron-reinforced door made it unlike any other space on the property. Over time, however, its purpose shifted, and what was once practical turned into something deeply unsettling. Servants whispered that the masters chose this room precisely because sound could not escape it, no matter how loud or desperate the cries became. Records from the early years of the plantation were vague, mentioning the room only in passing as a restricted area. No enslaved person was allowed to approach it without explicit permission, and even overseers avoided lingering nearby. Families spoke in hushed tones that anyone who entered did not return the same, if they returned at all. Children were warned to stay away, told that evil lived behind its iron door. The plantation's layout itself seemed to push people away from that corridor, as if the building remembered what happened there and recoiled from it. At some point, the owners ordered the room sealed completely, boarding up windows and reinforcing the door with heavy wooden planks. No official explanation was ever recorded, which only fueled speculation. Some believed a violent incident had occurred inside, so horrific that the family wanted to trap it within those walls. Others claimed that secrets too damaging to their reputation were hidden there, locked away with the hope that time would bury them. The silence surrounding the decision felt intentional, as though speaking about it would somehow awaken what lay inside. Among the enslaved community, stories began to circulate about what the room had once contained. Elders spoke of a hidden chamber where punishment was administered far from the eyes of guests. They described chains bolted to the walls, bloodstains on the floor, and a darkness that swallowed even the faintest light. These tales were passed from generation to generation, blending memory with legend until it became impossible to separate truth from terror. Yet the consistency of the stories suggested that something real had taken place behind that sealed door. The plantation owners treated the room as if it no longer existed, even as they went about their daily lives above it. Dinner parties continued, music filled the halls, and laughter echoed through the grand rooms, all while the boarded chamber remained untouched beneath their feet. Servants cleaning the house would avoid that corridor entirely, claiming that the air grew colder the closer one came. Some said they heard scratching sounds at night, as though something trapped inside was still alive and trying to escape. As years passed, the physical state of the room only deepened its mystery. Dust gathered thickly on the planks covering the door, and vines crept through cracks in the outer walls that bordered the chamber. No one ever attempted to reopen it, not even when new families acquired the property. The sealed entrance became a permanent fixture of the house, more like a tomb than a door. Visitors who learned of it felt an immediate chill, sensing that they were standing near something intentionally buried by history. Even long after slavery ended, the room remained locked, as if its purpose transcended time. Descendants of those who lived and worked on the plantation continued to speak about it in fearful tones, insisting that it held more than forgotten objects. To them, the chamber represented the worst cruelty of the past, a place where human suffering had been hidden rather than acknowledged. The mysterious room lingered in memory, rumor, and dread, waiting in silence for the moment when someone would finally dare to disturb its darkness. For decades after the room was sealed, the plantation settled into an uneasy stillness that felt less like peace and more like suspended breath. Ownership of the estate changed multiple times, yet every new family seemed to inherit not just the land, but its silence. Deeds were signed, renovations discussed, and workers hired, but the locked chamber was never mentioned in legal documents or household records. Even as walls cracked and roofs leaked, the boards covering that door remained intact, as though the house itself refused to let anyone disturb what lay behind them. The absence of curiosity was almost more chilling than the rumors that surrounded it. In the early years of its closure, former enslaved families who still lived nearby would gather at dusk and speak about the room in careful whispers. Some claimed they saw faint lantern light flicker behind boarded windows long after the last occupant had left the property. Others said they heard faint footsteps echoing through empty hallways during stormy nights. Yet no one dared to investigate, believing that opening the past would unleash consequences far worse than silence. Fear became a kind of invisible lock that kept people away just as effectively as iron and wood. As the 20th century unfolded, the plantation slowly fell into decay, but the sealed room remained untouched like a relic preserved in time. Vines crept up the outer walls, and rainwater pooled in cracked foundations. Yet the planks over the door never rotted or loosened. Caretakers who came and went avoided the western corridor entirely, claiming it made them dizzy or ill. Even professional inspectors cataloguing structural damage marked the chamber as inaccessible rather than attempting entry, choosing paperwork over confrontation with the unknown. Local legends grew stronger with each passing decade, weaving the room deeper into community memory. Children were warned not to wander too close, and teenagers told ghost stories that centered on the locked chamber as a place where the dead still walked. Some swore they saw shadows move behind the sealed boards at night, while others claimed the temperature dropped sharply whenever they passed the corridor. Whether these tales were fact or imagination, they ensured that the room remained socially forbidden long after its physical sealing. When the plantation was briefly converted into a historical site, tour guides deliberately avoided mentioning the chamber to prevent controversy. Visitors were shown elegant parlors and manicured grounds, while the boarded door was hidden behind velvet ropes and decorative drapery. Behind the scenes, historians debated whether to investigate, but fear of what might be discovered kept them silent. The room became a collective avoidance, a truth everyone sensed, but no one was willing to confront. Even after the property was abandoned entirely, the silence endured like an echo trapped in brick and timber. Trespassers who explored the crumbling house reported that the rest of the building felt hollow, yet the sealed room carried a heaviness that stopped them in their tracks. Some claimed they heard muffled breathing or scratching from within, though no evidence ever confirmed these accounts. Still, the stories ensured that no one attempted to break the seal, allowing the chamber to remain frozen in its decades-long isolation. By the time 60 years had passed, the sealed room had become more than just a locked space. It was a symbol of everything the plantation had tried to bury. Generations had lived, died, and moved away, while the chamber remained exactly as it was on the day it was closed. Weather, neglect, and time reshaped the rest of the estate. Yet this single door resisted change, as if guarding a truth that demanded the right moment to be revealed. People who lived along the dirt roads surrounding the plantation carried the room in their stories long before they ever saw it with their own eyes. Grandparents spoke of nights when the wind seemed to pause near the western wing, as if listening, and then rush away in panic. Fishermen returning late from the river swore that a dim glow sometimes seeped through cracks in the boarded walls, flickering like a dying lantern even when the house stood abandoned. These were not casual tales told for entertainment. They were spoken in lowered voices, passed across kitchen tables with eyes darting toward the darkness outside. Former workers and their descendants described feeling watched whenever they stepped onto the property. One elderly woman claimed that as a child she had heard slow footsteps pacing inside the sealed corridor, heavy and uneven, as though something wounded still moved within. She said the sound stopped only when she began to pray, and that the house seemed to inhale and exhale around her tiny body. Others remembered their parents forbidding them to play anywhere near that side of the mansion, warning that the room took people who wandered too close. Teenagers from nearby towns would dare one another to approach the door after sunset, yet none ever touched it. Several insisted they heard muffled voices behind the boards, overlapping in sorrowful murmurs that could not be understood. One boy fainted after claiming he saw a hand press against the wood from the inside, leaving a pale outline that vanished moments later. Whether real or imagined, these incidents spread quickly, deepening the aura of dread that surrounded the chamber. A traveling handyman who once worked on the property said he felt a crushing weight in his chest when he walked past the corridor. He claimed the air turned thick like smoke, even though nothing burned, and that his tools rattled on their own in his box. When he tried to place a ladder nearby, it slid across the floor without being pushed. He left the job unfinished and never returned, telling neighbors that the room did not want to be disturbed. Some witnesses spoke of strange animals appearing near the sealed wall at night. Dogs refused to bark but instead whimpered and crawled backward, tails tucked between their legs. Crows gathered in unusual numbers along the roofline above the chamber, remaining silent until dawn, when they scattered in frantic flight. Hunters in the nearby woods reported that their compasses spun wildly when they passed close to the plantation, as if something there bent the world itself. Local storytellers also preserved memories of enslaved ancestors who had warned that the room was a place of punishment far worse than whips or chains. They described hearing screams that echoed across fields in earlier decades, then abruptly ceased the same night the door was sealed. Even after emancipation, elders maintained that whatever had suffered there had never truly left, lingering between life and death inside the brick walls. These recollections blended grief with fear, making the room both a wound and a warning. By the time historians and curious outsiders began asking questions, the legends had solidified into something almost sacred. People refused to stand near the corridor, crossing themselves or whispering prayers when forced to pass. Visitors who mocked the stories often left shaken, claiming that unseen eyes followed them through empty halls. The sealed room had become more than a physical space. It was a living presence woven into the community's collective memory, shaping how generations understood the plantation's hidden darkness. Dawn settled over the ruined plantation in a thin grey veil that felt less like mourning and more like a reluctant witness. A small group of preservation workers arrived with trucks, cameras and equipment, unaware that they were stepping into something far heavier than crumbling brick. The house loomed in silence, its broken windows staring like empty eyes, while the boarded corridor seemed to pull attention toward it as though breathing. No birds sang, no insects buzzed, and even the wind appeared to circle the western wing instead of touching it. Every person present later said they felt the same uneasy pressure, as if the land itself knew what was about to happen. Inside the mansion, the air was stale and bitter, thick with decades of dust and decay. Flashlights cut through darkness in narrow beams that trembled in unsteady hands. The team moved carefully down the corridor toward the sealed door, stepping around fallen plaster and splintered floorboards. As they approached, one worker claimed the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath became visible. Another felt a sharp ringing in his ears, like a distant scream stretched into a single piercing note. No one spoke, yet their silence carried more tension than any shouted warning could have. When the first crowbar touched the wooden planks, the house seemed to shudder. Nails groaned as metal pried against them, sending vibrations through the walls that echoed like a heartbeat. Splinters fell slowly to the floor, swirling in flashlight beams like drifting ash. Several workers hesitated, stepping back as though an unseen force pushed them away, but the project leader insisted they continue. With every pull of the crowbar, the boards loosened, revealing darker slits behind them that swallowed light instead of reflecting it. As more planks were removed, a faint, stale scent drifted outward, a mixture of rot, rust, and something deeply organic that made stomachs turn. Cameras began recording, their lenses shaking as operators struggled to steady their nerves. One man swore he heard movement behind the door, a slow, dragging sound that paused whenever someone spoke. Sweat formed on brows despite the chill, and several workers crossed themselves instinctively, though none admitted why. The room was no longer just sealed. It felt awake. Finally, only the iron lock remained, thick with age and corrosion. The leader positioned a drill against it, hands trembling despite years of experience. The moment the metal bit into metal, a shrill vibration rang through the corridor, rattling loose glass and causing a small section of ceiling to crumble. Dust filled the air, and for a terrifying second, everyone believed the house might collapse. When the drill finally pierced the lock, a deep silence followed, heavier than before, as though something inside had noticed. With great effort, they pulled the door outward, its hinges screaming after 6 decades of stillness. Darkness poured out first, not as emptiness, but as a presence that seemed to lean forward. Flashlights hesitated at the threshold, their beams swallowed by a space that felt far deeper than it should have been. Several workers refused to step inside, claiming their legs would not move. From within came a faint, hollow echo, as if the room were inhaling after years of suffocation. The first glimpse revealed warped floorboards, chains bolted to brick, and walls streaked with stains that spoke of suffering too brutal to ignore. Shadows danced wildly across the interior, flickering in shapes that made some swear they saw figures pressed against the far wall. The air inside was suffocating, carrying the weight of everything that had been hidden there since the day the seal was hammered shut. The beam of the flashlight slid slowly across the threshold, and the first thing that emerged from the darkness was not dust, but presence. The floorboards were warped and buckled as if they had absorbed years of pressure, their surfaces scarred with deep gouges that looked like claw marks rather than decay. Along the left wall, heavy iron chains hung from rusted bolts drilled directly into the brick, some still fitted with thick cuffs lined with brittle leather. Beneath them, dark stains bled into the wood in uneven pools, layered so many times that no amount of cleaning could have removed them. The air carried a metallic bitterness that clung to skin and lingered in the throat. As light moved deeper, broken furniture appeared in jagged fragments, as though the room had once been violently ransacked. A splintered wooden table lay overturned, one leg shattered clean through, its surface carved with desperate scratches that formed no recognizable words. Scattered across the floor were shards of pottery, rusted tools, and lengths of frayed rope stiff with age. In one corner, a small iron brazier rested on its side, its interior blackened with soot that suggested it had burned long after the room was sealed. Even in stillness, the space felt chaotic, frozen in the aftermath of something that had never truly ended. The far wall revealed the most chilling sight, a narrow recess partly concealed by crumbling plaster. Inside it stood a small, skeletal frame made of wood and metal, clearly designed to restrain a body in an upright position. Thick iron rings dangled from its arms and legs, and a corroded collar rested at its center. Scratches scored the brick behind it, etched so deeply that they seemed carved by nails rather than tools. Flashlight beams trembled as they passed over this structure, and several workers instinctively stepped back, unable to look at it for long. Closer to the floor, investigators noticed personal items scattered among the debris, almost as if someone had tried to leave traces of themselves behind. A broken comb, a rusted button, and a tiny carved wooden figure lay half buried beneath layers of dirt. Near them rested a folded scrap of fabric, once bright but now faded to a ghostly grey, its edges torn and blood-stained. These fragments hinted at human presence, intimacy, and suffering far more clearly than any official record ever could. The room was not just a site of punishment, it was a place where lives had been trapped and broken. On the right wall, shelves had once been mounted, though most had collapsed under the weight of time. Among the wreckage lay weathered ledgers bound in cracked leather, their pages brittle and crumbling at the touch. When carefully opened, they revealed lists of names, dates, and cryptic notations written in harsh, angular script. Some entries were crossed out violently, ink pressed so hard it tore the paper. Interspersed between them were sketches of faces, drawn with haunting detail, their eyes dark and hollow. Near the back of the chamber, the floor dipped into a shallow pit lined with brick, partially filled with dirt and shattered bone fragments. Whether these remains belonged to animals or humans was not immediately clear, but their presence sent a cold shock through everyone in the room. Along the rim of the pit, iron hooks protruded at regular intervals, as if designed to hold something suspended above it. The space radiated a heaviness that made breathing difficult, as though the earth itself remembered what had happened there. As light finally reached the farthest corner, a heavy wooden chest came into view, its lid warped but still closed. Its surface was marked with strange symbols burned into the grain, some resembling crosses, others incomprehensible shapes. Thick chains wrapped around it several times, fastened with a padlock nearly as large as a fist. Dust lay undisturbed across its top, suggesting that no hand had touched it since the room was sealed, while the shadows around it seemed to shift with every flicker of light. The opening of the sealed room forced a brutal reconsideration of the plantation owners who had long been portrayed in local history as prosperous but respectable. For generations, their descendants had spoken of them as cultured landholders, men of law and faith who built schools, attended church, and hosted lavish gatherings. Paintings in nearby museums showed them in dignified poses, dressed in fine clothing with calm expressions that suggested control and refinement. Yet the evidence inside the hidden chamber shattered that carefully preserved image, revealing a far darker reality that had been deliberately buried beneath politeness, wealth, and time. Documents recovered from the room exposed a calculated system of secrecy that went far beyond ordinary cruelty. Ledgers showed that certain enslaved individuals were marked differently from others, listed not as laborers, but under coded terms that investigators later interpreted as punishment subjects. Marginal notes in the owner's handwriting revealed chilling intentions, including instructions to isolate, restrain, and permanently silence those who resisted or attempted escape. These were not impulsive acts of violence, but planned actions carried out with cold precision, suggesting that the family treated suffering as a tool rather than a consequence. Further examination of personal correspondence uncovered letters exchanged between the plantation owner and neighboring elites, discussing the need to control enslaved people through fear. In these letters, the hidden room was referenced indirectly as a necessary measure to maintain order and protect the family's reputation. The language was formal and detached, yet beneath it lay a willingness to commit acts that even their own peers would have condemned if publicly known. This revealed that the sealed chamber was not a secret accident but an intentional institution of terror. Witness accounts from descendants of enslaved families gained new credibility when compared with the physical evidence. Stories of people disappearing into the western wing and never returning matched the chains, restraints, and marks found inside the room. What had once been dismissed as folklore now appeared to be painful memory passed down through generations. The plantation owners had not only inflicted harm but worked tirelessly to erase proof, ensuring that future generations would remember them as honorable rather than cruel.